In 1930, John Maynard Keynes made a prediction so mathematically precise, impossible to get wrong, and that prediction was that your generation would work 15 hours a week. Keynes had already redesigned global finance at Bretton Woods and would go on to shape the International Monetary Fund. So when he made a forecast, governments restructured their economies around it. Every Silicon Valley founder betting on AI-driven productivity today is making the same bet Keynes made 94 years ago. And Keynes lost. Not because his economics failed, but because he underestimated something far more powerful than compound growth. He underestimated the human capacity to want more. And the answer to why you're still exhausted on Sunday nights, despite living in the most productive economy in human history, reveals something uncomfortable about your relationship with work, your phone, and the trillion-dollar industries built to make sure you never feel like you have enough. By 1930, Keynes had already become the most influential economist alive. Cambridge Don, architect of the Versailles Treaty's economic provisions, and the man whose ideas would shape the World Bank. His essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, laid out a staggeringly specific argument about compound growth in productivity, predicting that around 2% annual increases would multiply output eightfold over a century. 8 times more stuff from the same amount of work meant that if society only needed 1/8 the labor to maintain living standards, and if people preferred leisure to excess consumption, the average work week would collapse to 15 hours or less. Bertrand Russell agreed with this assessment. 2 years later, the philosopher published In Praise of Idleness, arguing that 4 hours of work per day was plenty, and that the rest should go to art, science, and human flourishing. 2 of the greatest minds of the 20th century looked at the same data and reached the same conclusion. And this was not utopian dreaming, but mathematics. Bureau of Labor Statistics data shows that productivity per hour worked has increased by roughly 400% since 1930, while GDP per capita, adjusted for inflation, now sits more than 6 times higher than it did then. A single American worker today produces more in 11 hours than their 1,930 counterpart produced in a full 40-hour week. Keynes also predicted something he called technological unemployment, his term and not ours, describing machines replacing human labor faster than new jobs could be created. He called it a temporary phase of maladjustment, which is the exact phrase you hear today about AI replacing software engineers. 94 years ago, Keynes named the phenomenon that makes every knowledge worker nervous about GPT. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Keynes made an assumption that once people had enough, once material needs were met, they would stop wanting and choose leisure, art, philosophy, and time with family instead. He called this the real permanent problem of humanity, learning how to use freedom wisely. His economics proved correct, but his read on human nature did not. The evidence is everywhere you look. In 1930, the average American worked about 47 hours per week, and today, for salaried professionals, the number often runs higher than that. Gallup surveys of knowledge workers consistently show 50-plus hour weeks across the board. The European Union has shorter hours, but nowhere near 15, while Japan coined the word karoshi for death from overwork, a phenomenon that kills an estimated 10,000 workers annually. South Korea logs some of the longest working hours in the OECD. Meanwhile, productivity per hour keeps climbing, which means we could work less because the math says so, Keynes said so, and Russell said so. We chose not to. Keynes's prediction was not wrong but incomplete because he understood production without understanding what happens to consumption when scarcity disappears. He definitely did not anticipate an entire industry dedicated to manufacturing desire. In Keynesian economics, you have effective demand, meaning what people want and can pay for. Keynes assumed effective demand had a ceiling, that once you had food, shelter, clothing, and reasonable comfort, you would feel satisfied and stop wanting more stuff in favor of wanting more time. Thorstein Veblen saw the flaw in this reasoning 30 years earlier when his 1899 book, The Theory of the Leisure Class, introduced the concept of conspicuous consumption, buying things not for utility but for status display. Veblen understood that human desire is not about having, but about having more than others. Keynes read Veblen and simply hoped we would outgrow it, but we did not outgrow it. We built trillion-dollar companies to exploit it instead. Here's the mechanism at work. In 1930, your desires were mostly your own because advertising existed only in primitive forms like print ads, radio spots, and billboards. You wanted what you needed plus some reasonable luxuries, and your neighbor's consumption was visible but limited since you only saw their house, their car, and their clothes. Comparisons stayed local. Your ancestors evolved comparing themselves to maybe 150 people, which is Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit for stable social relationships based on the size of the human neocortex. Your brain developed satisfaction metrics calibrated to a village. Instagram now asks that same brain to compare against 150 million people simultaneously, and the hardware cannot handle the load because it was never designed for this. Overtaxed systems glitch, and the glitch feels like inadequacy. This is the first principle Keynes missed, and it's called reference creep. Today, your reference point for enough is not your neighborhood, but a curated highlight reel from the top 0.1% of human consumption. Your brain's satisfaction metric, the one that would tell you it's okay to relax, keeps getting recalibrated upward by algorithmic feeds optimized for engagement rather than contentment. Keynes's 15-hour week assumed stable preferences, but preferences cannot remain stable when there is profit in destabilizing them. Every Super Bowl ad, every influencer partnership, and every limited time offer exists to solve Keynes's problem from the opposite direction, ensuring that no amount of productivity growth ever translates into less work, because there is always something else to want. The second principle Keynes missed cuts even deeper, and economist Fred Hirsch named it in 1976 when he described positional goods. A positional good derives its value precisely from the fact that others cannot have it, like the beachfront property, the Ivy League degree, the reservation at that restaurant with the unlisted phone number, or the verification checkmark before they sold them to everyone. A Hermes Birkin bag costs $10,000 and has a 2-year waitlist. But here's what most people miss about that arrangement. The waitlist is the product. If everyone could buy one tomorrow, the bag would become worthless because the scarcity is not a bug in the supply chain, but the entire value proposition. The bag commands that price because you cannot have it, and your desire gets measured by someone else's exclusion. That dynamic makes positional goods impossible to scale. If everyone has beachfront property, then beachfront property stops being special since the supply is fixed by definition. As society gets richer, exactly as Keynes predicted, people do not stop wanting but shift their spending from absolute goods like food, shelter, and transportation to positional goods where the competition never ends. Positional goods require work, not because you need the money for survival, since Keynes was right that we solved that, but because status operates as a treadmill with no finish line. Harvard's acceptance rate in 1930 sat above 80%, while today it falls under 4%. The university did not get academically harder. Everyone got richer, everyone wanted the positional good, and the competition intensified by a factor of 20. The diploma stayed the same, while the scarcity value exploded. Keynes imagined a world where productivity gains meant everyone worked less, but when the gains funnel into positional competition, nobody works less. Everyone works more, fighting over the same fixed supply prizes where your success requires someone else's failure. That is not a bug in capitalism, but the operating system. This dynamic explains Silicon Valley better than any business book ever written. The tech industry's most successful products like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok are not productivity tools at all. They function as positional goods factories that let you compare, compete, and signal status at unprecedented scale while manufacturing desires faster than any economy could satisfy them. Netflix's autoplay feature uses the same variable reward schedule that B.F. Skinner documented in Pigeons back in the 1950s. Random reinforcement creates compulsive behavior, where the pigeon keeps pecking and the user keeps scrolling because the next reward might be the big one. Slot machine designers perfected this technique decades ago, and Silicon Valley did not invent behavioral addiction but simply made it scalable. This is not a bug in the business model, but the business model itself. Attention economics, pioneered by Herbert Simon in 1971 when he noted that information abundance creates attention scarcity, treats your focus as the resource to be captured and monetized. The entire architecture works to prevent the satisfaction Keynes assumed would naturally emerge from abundance. Netflix CEO Reed Hastings said their biggest competitor is sleep, describing a product strategy to capture every moment of attention that is not work, while also describing the cultural condition we have built. We have made peace with sleeping, barely, but waking non-work time feels like territory to be conquered, optimized, and monetized. Every time you scroll, you see someone with something you lack, whether a vacation, a body, an achievement, or a possession. Your brain registers this as lack through the same neural circuitry that told your ancestors to keep foraging because winter was coming. That lack becomes desire, and that desire becomes either a purchase or the motivation to work more, to afford a future purchase. The loop never closes. But that is not even the most important principle Keynes missed. The third thing, and this is the one that explains hustle culture, burnout, and why Elon Musk can say nobody ever changed the world on 40 hours a week, while millions of people nod along, is work as identity. In 1930, work for most people was instrumental, meaning you worked to live, and the purpose of labor was the paycheck. If you could live without the paycheck, there was no reason to labor, and this seems so obvious to Keynes that he did not think it needed defending. Somewhere between then and now, work became identity. Not for everyone, but disproportionately for the educated, affluent knowledge workers who actually had the option to work less. The people who could afford Keynes's 15-hour week are the ones who work the most. Sociologist Max Weber saw this pattern emerging back in 1905 when his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, traced how religious anxiety about salvation got channeled into relentless labor. If you could not know whether you were among God's elect, at least you could prove you were industrious, which meant idleness became sin and work became virtue. Not because work produced salvation, but because it produced the feeling that you deserved it. The religious framing faded, but the pattern did not. Today, when someone asks who you are, you tell them what you do. I'm a founder, I'm an engineer, I'm a creator, I'm building something. Your work is not something you perform for 40 hours and leave at the office, but something you are permanently. Even in the shower, even at your kid's soccer game, even at 2 a.m. when you cannot sleep because you are thinking about that email you did not send. When work is identity, working less means being less. That explains why the people who could most easily afford Keynes's 15-hour week, tech executives, successful entrepreneurs, and highly paid professionals often work the most. When Musk tweets about sleeping on factory floors, he is not describing necessity but virtue, and the flex is not the car or the rocket but the suffering. The money is not the point here. Daniel Kahneman's Nobel Prize-winning research demonstrated that beyond roughly $75,000 annually, more income does not increase day-to-day emotional well-being. You can argue about the exact threshold, but the principle holds, and past a certain point you are not working for happiness, but for something else. Meaning, status, identity, and the terror of not knowing who you are if you are not producing. Keynes imagined that material security would lead people to cultivate philosophy, art, and relationships, and some do exactly that. But most do not, because we never built the cultural infrastructure for meaningful leisure. We built the opposite. Think about your own education. From age 5, you trained for work because school is structured like work with schedules, tasks, evaluations, rankings, and the anxiety of being behind. You spent 2 decades optimizing for achievement metrics that someone else defined, and now you have a Saturday off and feel a low-grade panic about wasting it. That anxious, guilty feeling when you are not being productive is not a bug in your psychology, but the training working exactly as designed. Juliet Shaw documented this pattern in The Overworked American back in 1991, tracking the paradox of rising productivity and rising work hours. Americans were working a full month more per year than they had 2 decades earlier, even as output per hour kept climbing. The treadmill was already accelerating, and social media just added rocket fuel. This explains why remote work during the pandemic felt so psychologically complicated. Starting in 2020, millions of knowledge workers discovered they could do their jobs in far fewer hours than the traditional office required. Commute time vanished, pointless meetings became reducible, and actual focused work, when tracked, honestly came to maybe 4 hours a day. The rest had always been performance, looking busy, being visible, and justifying your presence. Keynes would have called this progress and finally the liberation he predicted, but many workers called it disturbing. Surveys showed widespread anxiety about being seen as slacking, and managers invested in surveillance software, including mouse movement trackers, screenshot monitors, and keystroke loggers. Workers performed busyness on Slack, sending messages at odd hours to prove they were engaged, while a significant portion of people actually wanted to return to offices not for productivity but for the structure and identity that being physically at work provides. We got closer to the 15-hour week than ever before, and stripped of the performance, many jobs revealed themselves to be exactly what Keynes predicted, requiring far less time than we pretend. And we could not handle it because the freedom was too frightening. The tech industry did not just fail to deliver Keynes's vision, but built the exact opposite and called it progress. Every product that captures attention fills leisure time with something that feels like work, from the infinite scroll to the notifications to the engagement metrics on your posts. You are not resting when you are on social media, but performing, curating, competing, working on your personal brand, and checking the numbers. Even entertainment got optimized for productivity-adjacent feelings. Morning routine videos have become a genre. There is a market for apps that gamify your rest, and self-care now means optimization with the right supplements, the tracked sleep, and the quantified recovery. Pure leisure feels like failure, so we turned leisure into another domain to be won. The gig economy makes this explicit through Uber, DoorDash, TaskRabbit, and Instacart, all of which converted leisure time into monetizable work time. That 15 hours Keynes imagined you would spend reading philosophy can now be spent driving strangers around for $11 an hour instead. Not because you need the money for survival, since many gig workers have other income, but because unmonetized time feels wasted when the app is right there and the hours are just sitting there doing nothing. Anthropologist David Graeber called many modern jobs bullshit jobs, roles that even the people performing them suspect are pointless, all paper-pushing and box-checking and meetings about meetings. His 2018 book estimated that up to 40% of workers believed their jobs made no meaningful contribution to the world, but they kept doing them because the alternative of admitting that the work was not necessary threatened their sense of self too much. What economists figured out in 1930, and what the entire attention economy has profited from ever since, is that scarcity is not just an economic condition, but a psychological one, and psychological scarcity can be manufactured infinitely. Keynes solved the production problem, and we created new problems to fill the void. Reference creep ensures you never feel like you have enough. Positional goods ensure competition never ends. Work as identity ensures leisure feels like death, and the entire attention economy fills any remaining gaps with consumption, performance, and the anxiety of comparison. Manufactured desire follows the same pattern as drug tolerance, where you need an increasing dose to achieve the same effect. And that is not a metaphor, but neuroscience. The dopamine system that governs wanting adapts to stimulation, which means yesterday's luxury becomes today's baseline, becomes tomorrow's deprivation. The hedonic treadmill is not a bug in human psychology, but a feature that evolved when scarcity was real, and now it is being exploited by systems designed to keep you running. Here's what nobody mentions about Keynes. He saw this coming too. In a 1930 letter, he wrote about the struggle for subsistence being replaced by the struggle for position and precedence. He predicted the positional treadmill, understood that scarcity could be social rather than material, and just hoped we would be wise enough to step off. He dared us to build a society where enough was enough, and we declined. The people who actually live something like Keynes's vision, working less while maintaining quality of life, share certain characteristics, and none of them are accidental. First, they have consciously limited their reference points by not scrolling feeds that show them consumption they cannot have and opting out of comparison games entirely. This is not minimalism as Instagram aesthetic, but minimalism as psychological defense against manufactured desire. Second, they have identified which goods they are pursuing are positional and asked whether the competition is worth it. The house in the best school district, the selective college for their kids, the startup that could exit big, and the promotion that requires 60-hour weeks all fall into this category. Some of these are worth pursuing, but pursuing all of them guarantees maximum work with minimum satisfaction. You cannot win every status game, and choosing which ones to play and which ones to forfeit is the first step off the treadmill. Third, they have built identity around something other than work, which is the hardest part. It requires actively constructing meaning from relationships, creative pursuits, and community involvement, things that feel indulgent in a culture that celebrates hustle, calls exhaustion passion, and treats burnout as a badge of honor. It requires being okay with the question of what do you do, having an answer that does not impress people at parties. The FIRE movement, financial independence, retire early, represents people trying to manually implement Keynes's vision by saving aggressively, investing the surplus, and exiting the workforce decades before traditional retirement. They have done the math Keynes did and reached the same conclusion that the economy does not need you to work 40 hours and that you are choosing to. They choose not to. But even within FIRE communities, you see the struggle. People retire at 40 and do not know what to do with themselves because the freedom Keynes promised feels like emptiness. They start blogs, optimize their hobbies, and turn leisure into work because that is the only way they know how to feel valuable. The 15-hour week is available and has been since 1970, arguably, and it is definitely available now, especially for knowledge workers in wealthy countries. But it requires opting out of systems specifically designed to prevent it. And it requires believing, really believing, and not just intellectually acknowledging that you are not your productivity. Keynes's prediction is not wrong, but waiting. The economic preconditions have been met, while the psychological preconditions have not, and no technology will deliver them. Not AI, not automation, not the next productivity app. The constraint was never technological. The uncomfortable truth about AI and automation, the debate we are having right now that Keynes already had in 1930, is that everyone is worried AI will eliminate jobs, and that is a real concern for transition and displacement. But the deeper concern is different. What if AI does exactly what Keynes's productivity growth did and actually works? What if we solve the new production problem just like we solved the old one? We will have even more capacity for leisure, and the math will be even more undeniable. And if the last century is any indication, we will fill it with new forms of manufactured scarcity, new positional competitions, and new ways to feel like we are not enough. We will invent new status games to play with the time we freed up, and find new ways to convert abundance into anxiety. The technological unemployment Keynes predicted is not really about unemployment, but about what we do with the capacity that technology frees up. So far, the answer has been to convert it into new forms of work, new forms of competition, and new forms of dissatisfaction that feel productive. Economic possibilities for our grandchildren was not wrong about economics, but wrong about grandchildren. It assumed we would inherit the capacity for satisfaction from a generation that knew real scarcity, but you cannot inherit what was never built. You cannot opt into leisure when every institution you have ever encountered trained you for work. Keynes understood production, but underestimated the production of desire. What economists figured out in 1930, and what psychologists, sociologists, and now Silicon Valley product managers all exploit, is a unified principle that cuts across all of it. Reference creep, positional goods, and workers' identity are not separate problems, but all expressions of the same truth. Scarcity solved at the material level recreates itself at the psychological level, and abundance does not satisfy but raises the bar. The 15-hour week is not an economic achievement, but a psychological one. It requires feeling like enough is enough, and nothing in the current economy, nothing in the attention architecture, and nothing in the identity structures we have built wants you to feel that way. There is no profit in satisfaction, no engagement in contentment, and no status in stepping off the treadmill. Next time you feel guilty for resting, actually resting and not recovering for productivity, ask yourself whose problem your exhaustion is solving, yours, or the system that needs you to keep running. The best life is not built by working more, but by wanting less. Keynes understood the economics and just overestimated our willingness to accept the answer. He gave us a dare disguised as a prediction, and 94 years later, the dare still stands. Economics and psychology seem like separate fields until you realize they determine everything about how you spend your finite hours. That is what we do here, finding the hidden mechanisms connecting how systems work to how you actually live. Want to see how a 1950s mathematician's discovery about cooperation explains why your remote team's Slack channel is a disaster? Subscribe, because next week we are covering game theory and the meeting that should have been an email. Comment below with what you would actually do with a 15-hour work week. Not what you think you should do, but what you would really do.